Welcome everybody to the 17th Annual Platypus International Convention. Platypus organizes reading groups, coffee breaks, and public fora like this one around problems inherited from the old, new, and post-political left. Today, we have a panel on what is society and why does it have politics, or why does society have politics? I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers in the order that they will be speaking. We have Alex Higgins with Prometheus Journal. We have Douglas Lane from Sublation Media. Dave McCarricker from Theory Underground, and Bill Ayers, an activist.
Without portfolio.
So, I'll read the panel description and questions. So the way it's going to work, each panelist will have 10 minutes for their opening remarks in response to the questions I'm about to read. And then we will have 3 to 5 minutes for the panelists to respond to each other. And then we are going to open it up for questions and answers. In the wake of DSA, Momentum, Syriza, Podemos, and other neo-social democratic formations, two seemingly opposed turns have taken shape on the left against electoralism. A turn to civil society organizing and to the party. The obvious reference point uniting these are the mass socialist parties of the pre-war Second International, which were based in society and had an electoral arm. The failure of this international occasioned the travails and regroupments of the left in the 20th century. If the 2015 neo-social democratic moment revealed that Lenin was a Kautskyian, this turn to society and through it to the party may prompt us now to ask in what way Kautsky was liberal. This panel takes a step back and asks, what is society? Or civil society, terms which Marx used interchangeably. Why does society have party politics? What was Marx's critique of liberal parties and socialist parties, and more broadly, of liberalism and of socialism? Does Marx have a critique of democracy? What is the legacy of progressivism and the new left social movements? Have feminism and anti-racism been fully co-opted by the Democratic Party, or do they still have emancipatory purchase? How will civil social organizing differ in Trump's second term as opposed to his first? Most basically, where does society come from, what is it, and why is this crisis political? What is society and politics for the left today? And with that, starts off.
Cool, how's that? Is that too close? Okay. So I'm going to leave the question of Marx's interpretation of civil society to other people, hopefully they'll be engaged with. But I did come across something in preparation for this that I think provides a bit of a jumping off point. So it's an old article by Jeffrey Hunt about Marx's thinking on civil society. And according to Hunt, for the younger Marx, he sort of upheld this distinction between civil society and politics and rendered it reasonably conventionally with sort of some qualifications. But later on, he sort of critiqued this in a more wholesale way and sort of dispensed with it. And talk more about the mode of production as something which, unlike civil society, could describe historicize the realm of production beyond the capitalist period. So I'm interested to see how others sort of whether this resonates with how others interpret Marx's use of the term. But what struck me was interesting in Hunt's account was this version of 19th century political thought of civil society as something kind of dirty, the space where humans are atomized and behave in an egoistic way, and politics is something where we find a more collective, idealized mode of being. And this, sort of resonates with how people talk about what we call the private sector and the public sector. In Britain today, the private sector is cutthroat, and the public sector, services and enterprises run by the state, is sort of inclined towards the public good. On the other hand, the idea of civil society is something dirty and messy. It inverts the popular anti-political sentiment of today, which is a very widespread sentiment on the left as well as the right. And this conceives of politics as inherently corrupt and driven by egoistic individuals. And civil society in our workplaces, our families and communities, that's where we find the realization of our need for these sort of more collective forms of existence. So why this is interesting to me today is this raises the question of why Marx thought that the working class needed politics and could find in politics the forms of democratic collective life which could realize socialism. Split this into sort of 3 points. Why the working class needs politics, why this necessitates a political party, and what working class political rule might look like. So in my view, we need to make the case for politics, as I'm sure you've been doing yourselves, and struggle against this anti-political tendency and make this case for political action at the state level, the continental level, even the global level. And Marx provides us with some insight into why this might be seen as necessary for the working class and how we might be pushing at an open door at times. So as Mike McNair points out in Revolutionary Strategy, for Marx and Engels, it's not workers' strength at the point of production per se, which made them the potential revolutionary subject, but actually their separation from the means of production. And this produces a need for collective voluntary organizations. And at its highest level of development, this produces a party and could lead to socialism and the general emancipation of society. So this is useful to reflect on today. One is a counterbalance to the commonly expressed view that workers can sort of bring the system to its knees through action at the point of production, which is, an effective agitational pro-union sentiment. In a sense, it's true, but it misses the really radical potential of workers to transform society as a whole. Secondly, today, economic and social life of the working class has become, once again, more like it was in the 19th century than in the 20th century. We have sort of precarious, atomized work, mostly in small workplaces. And this presents a huge challenge for primary organizing, which you constantly hear people talking about. And if we restrict our view of workers' agency to the point of production, then we might become disorientated and dispirited, as many have. But instead, this sort of should remind us of this need for collective action. Sure, new forms of trade unionism, which better encompass the unemployed and extend out of the workplace to communities, to the district level, but also for political action through an independent working class party. And then second point, to sort of expand on that point about the party, there is an objective need for a party, specifically to produce unity across these various sectional interests of the employed, and across the employed and unemployed, including especially those excluded from work due to disability and ill health, the elderly, and so on. In short, between everyone dependent on the wage form. And this sort of expansive definition of the working class it's very useful. But at the same time, it's also required sort of subjectively because of the strength of the ideological and political structures of the capitalist state that protect the capitalist regime. So thinking like on the ideological side, if we want to defeat the propaganda of the pro-capitalist press, its research institutions, and so on, this requires a massive counter-propaganda effort with newspapers, magazines, media, and streamers or whatever. And this means pooling resources on a big scale. So these kind of diffuse efforts, which we tend to make in sort of small groups or as individuals, is just not enough. And then when we come to the question of the state's like repressive arm, we need a concentrated effort of political thought and capacity for action, which again can only really come from a party.
Alex.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. And just for a sort of a final point, we also learn from this idea of society and politics and how we distinguish between the two. Something about what working class political rule might look like. So, again, returning to Marx can be very helpful. We're faced with an immense challenge created by the history of the 20th century, as we've been hearing in the earlier panel today. And socialism has become associated with tyranny and bureaucratic rule. And so the Republican strain of Marxist thought, which has been recovered recently, especially by authors like Bruno Leopold and William Clare Roberts, can offer some inspiration. Marx, ignited by the experience of the Paris Commune, talked a lot about the sort of the concept of social republic, where you can have universal suffrage, but also a more expansive sense of democracy, where your representatives are bound by an imperative mandate and disciplined by immediate recall, and you have more frequent elections and things like that. And this is a kind of bridge as well between the party and our ideas of socialism. This is something that we can kind of prefigure. We can't, transcribe these prescriptions wholesale, but they provide a useful model for thinking about extending democracy, which will be different in different contexts. Cool. I think that's about that. Thank you.
Okay. Is this on? All right. Okay, so, Bill.
Doug.
Yes. 2 years before I was born, you and your comrades in the Weather Underground were already convinced that the U.S. empire was at an impasse, was in decline. The United States was apparently in a full, possibly terminal crisis by 1974, when you published the Prairie Fire. Assumptions about the character of the United States, the idea that it was a country founded upon Enlightenment ideals and a revolutionary ambition for liberty, had been turned on its head. America's cultural power was waning, and conditions were favorable for revolutionaries. Today, more than a half century later, my 28-year-old son tells me that the last quarter of the 20th century produced the greatest works of mass culture in history. The 70s through the late 90s or early 2000s were, in his opinion, the zenith of American soft power. Rock, rap, and other popularized experimental works of art from that period dominate his rack of albums and digitized collection of films. The Talking Heads, 77, for example, and The French Connection with Gene Hackman are examples of his, let's see, I went back, all right. Are examples of from his media library. Let's see. Okay, he is less convinced that the United States is declining than you were in 74, but he suspects that the story of US decline is plausible, even if he doesn't believe that this decline is desirable or will lead to socialism. He's recently joined a Platypus reading group, by the way. When he isn't writing code for Nike or thinking about his 401k, he is reading Marx's 18th Brumaire, biking, or taking in what passes for art films in the 21st century. He recommends a new flick called Substance about an aged Gen X movie star who takes a pill and is transformed into a sexy Zoomer. I think that the trajectory of Bin's thinking demonstrates, hold on a second. This is why you don't use your phone to do this. Okay, I think the trajectory of his thinking demonstrates that it is possible for leftists to break free from the hold that you and the rest of the old new left have had on the left's imagination for coming on 3 generations. But I don't think his mindset is commonplace. Unfortunately, most younger leftists are mere copies of the old leftists. The French radical Guy Debord once wrote that the students of the 60s were both trapped in a protracted infancy and afflicted with a premature senescence. I need to be reminded, but I think Debord wrote that in Comments on the Society of Spectacle, may have been on the poverty of student life. I know that in Waiting for Godot, Beckett had a character named Pozo say, they give birth astride a grave, the light gleams an instant, then it's night once more. The primary error from Bill here and the Weather Underground, which is to say the primary error of today's left, is that it dilutes the meaning of terms like revolution, radical, and even anti-imperialism. Instituting a dictatorship of the proletariat would not be the same as taking power through and for mass democracy under capitalism. Rather, seizing political power for workers, however this is accomplished, will merely give workers the opportunity to overcome the class basis of society. The aim must be the self-abolition of the working class, which is to say that the workers after the revolution will have to be more creative than the bourgeoisie, more transformative than even Barack Obama. It would be easy and also boring to point out how the Weather Underground, having rejected responsibility and transformation and reinforced and reified society as it was and still is. What is slightly more interesting and helpful to notice is how the radical pose of Bill has been mainstreamed. Today's suburban Democrats and centrist TV personalities, Bill Burr, for example, routinely shouts, "Free Luigi," as Tim Walz encourages vandalism and maybe even arson in service of electing Democrats in the 2026 midterms. The topics and questions selected by the Platts for this panel are on or revolve around the question of society. A decade ago, society became a meme. Society had something to do with the television show Seinfeld in 2015, and then after the movie Joker was released, the phrase, "we live in a society," was adjoined to us still from the movie. So what is society? Is it a meme? The questions given to me by Platypus seem to have been lifted from a final exam for a critical theory course at the University of Chicago. I'll answer them quickly and hope to luck out like I did when I guessed my way through the SATs in 1989. Where does society come from? What is it? Society emerged from the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. It started out as a third estate. This was a realm where free labor began its rise, setting up all the social relations that mediate all the others on the planet. After the death of God, our own collective and productive activity emerged as a new Geist. Marx would say society is founded upon our productive material activity. All of its features, its various religions, sexual practices, and sports teams are guided by the right to work, how and where and when you like, and to receive back from the market what you put into it. Why is society political? Why does society have party politics? Politics were necessary as this revolutionary form of freedom as society took hold and spread. As bourgeois freedom spread, it did so on the basis of the old state powers of the feudal empires, given as labor transformed these old powers into something new. In the US, the need for a federal government arose in the context of adversarial relations with Europe. The free United States had to be organized and secured in order to withstand external pressure. Internal differences born from uneven development also necessitated the formation of a centralized state. The need for parties, something the founding fathers wanted to avoid, reflected the need for institutions that could mediate conflicts emerging from the market under conditions defined by a still developing freedom. The semi-permanence of the parties is a product of the industrialization of automation of the automation of free labor. Okay. The Federalist Party represented the interests of industry of this process of automation, and the Democratic Republican Party represented the interests of artisan workers, farmers, and local financiers. Marx, as a kind of Hegelian, did not side with either faction, but aimed to remain true to the bourgeois ideology that excited him. He advocated for working class powers' independence and self-abolition. His work theorized the contradictions in society, the contradictions that led to the need for a state. He wrote of labor's self-alienation, of how the economic relations were always political, even when they functioned perfectly, as if in a laboratory or a vacuum. He did not see democracy as the maximal goal of socialism, but rather thought the development of workers' freedom, the sublation of bourgeois right, was the true aim. The parties represented different factions in a society that was geographically divided and where the division of labor was spatial and cultural. They remained necessary for as long as the workers and socialists failed to overcome these divisions. And in the 20th century, they only changed through the slow motion process of capitalist innovation and mass democracy. What is a legacy of progressivism and the new left social movements? These can both be understood as accommodations to the defeat of Marxism and more broadly of socialism. They should be understood as the ideologies and the political agents who delivered and reinforced these defeats. The progressives, starting with William Jennings Bryan, co-opted socialist and populist political movements in an effort to maintain and develop the state and stave off socialist transformation. Bourgeois freedom, free labor, contradicted itself, turned into a form of unfreedom through the state and through the statification of society in reaction to the self-alienation of labor through automation and industrialization. Final question here. Have feminism and anti-racism been fully co-opted by the Democratic Party, or do they still have emancipatory purchase? Feminism and anti-racism are cultural movements aimed at changing social roles and attitudes. They aim not to transform society, but to cope with it by taking charge of its dysfunctions, freezing them in place, and institutionalizing them. Feminist and anti-racist movements persist over time, one emerging after the other declines. In the last decade, Black Lives Matter was followed by Me Too, which was then followed by Black Lives Matter again. Today, Andrea Dworkin is making a comeback online. This happens because these social problems have ready-made solutions, even if none of them really work. They are safely ineffectual, which means that they can be returned to in the same way again and again. The feminists and anti-racists are conservatives. They're conservationists, actually, with a better track record than the Sierra Club. Unfortunately, what they conserve is what Guy Debord once called a society of the spectacle, or what Adorno more simply called a wrong life. And I'll leave it there.
Test, okay. Is it okay if I don't use this?
Yeah.
I don't like this thing.
Okay.
So is it 10 minutes or 12?
10.
Okay. I spent some time practicing to get it under 12 minutes, and I couldn't. Now I'm down to 10, so I'll just jump ahead, start in the middle, and summarize a little bit, first by saying hello, everybody. And it's an honor to be here. Yeah, thank you. Also, hi, Mom and Dad. I didn't expect they would be watching this. And even though they are watching this, I'll still address myself to the left, or whatever remains of it. So, hi, Bill. It's really nice to meet you, as well as you, Bernadine. It's great that you're here. I was just reading about you on the Idaho Capitol steps last week, because we were thinking about the weathermen. And the week before that, well, preparation for this, of course, and we read through your manifesto that you all wrote.
Which one?
The one that was called, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing."
And that's still true, right?
And he said, that's still true. Well, then why did you write it? If you don't need a weatherman, then why did you write it? No, it's a wonderful piece. It's very, it's very clear and concise, but also, I think thorough. And so it really helps me see your position. And so I appreciate that. And it's also good to be here with Doug and Alex. So, okay. So I'm David McCarricker, and I'm with Theory Underground. And for the last 5 years now, I've been working on a research project in preparation to write a book that I think I need to write to the parents of the children who will be 25 in 30 years. And this way of thinking is meant to establish some kind of intergenerationality into my life, because I think that there's been an intergenerational breakdown, right? There's not working class educational institutions that assume that we actually need to critically suspend the presuppositions of our inheritance, of our common sense, of our society. And instead, a lot of our leftist elders are here to tell us what's what. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. But my position is a skeptical one, but it's not an absolutely skeptical one. I do believe I have a lot to learn from other people, and I do believe that other people know things I do not. One of the big research projects over those 5 years has been in critical media theory. Now, this research project started with my burnout in 2020, which really kind of started in 2019 with that whole no clapping thing, and kind of culminated in the Dr. Adolf Reed Jr. being canceled by the DSA. At that point, I felt kind of embarrassed to have founded a chapter of the DSA in Boise, Idaho. I was like, well, these are not my people. Now, I really do love some people who are still involved with the DSA. You know, many of them are very fine people, right?
Oh, jeez.
I consider them friends, brothers, sisters, cousins, but no less than certain conservatives in my life. And what I'm worried about is how the left becomes the shock troops of capital, in how it has, in the last 100 years, produced what I call the post-class fractured mass. Now, I was here for a lot of the panels yesterday, and that's when I discovered, during, I think, Pam's presentation, that David Graeber and a couple of other people were talking about post-class this, post-class that, and I was like, great, now I sound like them. That's not what I'm trying to do with the PCFM. The post-class fractured mass is not to say that we are post-class, like class is now irrelevant. Class has defined every aspect of my life, my horizon of possibilities, as well as every one of yours, right? It's framed by our position in the relations of production, which is the relations of production. Those exist to reproduce the mode of production. I think we can all agree on that. I kind of wanted to start on a couple of the things that we all agree on before we get into any sort of contradictions. I think that we all agree that humans can be more than just tools. That humans can self-actualize, to put it in sort of simple terms, right? Terms captured by psychology, perhaps. But I like to talk about that as virtual purposiveness. We're beings who need direction. We're beings who, if we have the time and the energy, discover that we have some kind of a calling. And that's usually connected to our talent, right? And so what we are dealing with when it comes to poverty, it's not something that's limited, obviously, to the proletariat or the lumpen proletariat. It's something that everyone experiences. A poverty of civil life. A poverty of people who are reduced by the commodity form to labor power, right? So what is the process of that reduction? And what does that have to do with critical media theory? And how does that result in the PCFM, the post-class fractured mass? And how does that relate to the question about politics and society? Well, it's a lot of questions. Good thing we have a long Q&A. I'll skip ahead now. So the revolutionary subject, I take it to be a decisive point of disagreement between the old and the new left. For the old left, the revolutionary subject was not the working class, it was, at least in the Marxist sense, specifically the proletariat, which was separate from other elements of the working class. It was supposed to be the most revolutionary arm of the working class, for reasons that I have quotes here. I could read, but I won't. So, I mean, I'd love to get into them later, maybe, if you want to take a look at these. I'll probably share them somewhere. With the new left, they're like, no, it's not going to work quite that way. So who is the revolutionary subject? Well, it's Black Americans, especially young ones, student ones, and the Vietnamese as a sort of metonym for the third world, right? And whenever I read any of this stuff, I always just feel sympathetic, right? I just feel like, yeah, if I was there at that time, I would think that. But I'm wondering now, should we be thinking that there is a revolutionary subject, right? And if so, what is its composition? And this is still an open question for me. I hope through this that I will find some people who have ideas, and we'll be able to have a conversation. 3 minutes. So, the post-class fractured mass. I want to say, in honor of Platypus, an organization founded on the idea that sometimes reality does not match our conceptions that we think are scientific. If you don't know the story about Engels actually finding out that platypuses are real, it's a lot of fun. You should definitely check it out. It's on the Platypus site. I think about this all the time. So in honor of that, in honor of Platypus, and also of Marx, I want to actually call it the potato class fractured mass. Because from the 18th Brumaire, or in the 18th Brumaire, Marx says, when he's talking about the peasants and why they're not the revolutionary subject, he says the small-holding peasants form an enormous mass whose members live in similar conditions but without entering into manifold relations with each other. Very like we are today. He says their mode of production isolates them from one another instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse. Jumping down. Thus, the great mass of the French nation is formed by the simple addition of homologous magnitudes, much as potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. So I think we are. I think we're potatoes in a sack. And I think that there are three major and often overlooked elements that produce the PCFM are the medium, which I think from McLuhan through Virilio to Baudrillard, I think Debord would be a good reference here as well. Something I call gerrymandering Befindlichkeit. It's a German word for attunement, and it has to do with fundamental dispositions. And I'm saying at the level of our fundamental dispositions, we've been gerrymandered, right? And then there's also another element that is escaping me in the moment because my notes are total wreck here. Oh, the school, which is also technically a medium, but progressive schooling, and I'm using the word progressive in the sort of way of Woodrow Wilson, right? Progressive schooling was rolled out to preempt and undermine working class organizing, and it succeeded. And if there is a we here, it lost. And now we're behind enemy lines. And coming to terms with that, I think, is what Platypus is all about, and that's why I appreciate you all. Thank you.
I will be brief. I liked it that everybody was introduced with an organization, and I was introduced as an activist. And of course, whenever you're defined by a single word, you want to say, and so much more. But I have been an activist all my adult life. I've also been a professor, a writer, many things. But I come to you now mostly as a teacher, somebody who started teaching in 1965 and has never stopped teaching. I currently teach in prison, and I often begin my teaching, because this is how I begin my thinking and my organizing, by asking questions, often with a prompt. So last week we read a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, in homage to Paul Robeson, and then the prompt was, who are your people? Who do you depend on? Who claims you and who do you claim? And one of my students wrote, well, the state of Illinois claims me, but I don't claim them. And there was a lot of talk about liberation and about what people mean by freedom. And frankly, that's kind of where I am in my life, is mainly with questions. And so the questions I have are not the questions that were given to us in this prompt, which frankly, I didn't begin to know how to answer. Where does society come from? What is it? My questions are, where are we on the clock of the universe? What does the known demand of us now? What does freedom mean? And what is abolition? What political moment are we living through? And what's required of us? Where does theory come from? So those are the kinds of questions that I wrestle with all the time. And I don't feel like I have answers. In fact, I've felt for the last 50 years that I don't have a lot to teach young people. I have a lot to learn from young people. And so I was very thrilled and honored that at my 80th birthday, it was overwhelmingly people under 35 at my birthday, because that's who I tend to hang out with. That's who I tend to learn from on questions like, how's the world treating you? How are you treating the world? What does it mean to be alive now? And what's required of us now? So I think I'll just take a couple of those questions and riff on them just for a minute. I'll be brief. I think we're living in a particular political moment. I just came from a demonstration downtown affirming the idea that I am an activist, and kind of astonished that you're not there. Because where does theory come from? I'm not scolding you, I'm just saying, are we going out into the national demonstration, or are we too certain that we're finding the right class and the right theory, and we know what we're doing without interacting in the world? The famous quote from Marx, philosophers up until now have described the world. The point, however, is to change it. And I think that's something that we need to come back to again and again. So where are we right now? What is this political moment? I think that we're in a political moment where we have a constitutional fascist government. Not yet a fascist society, but moving in that direction quickly. What is fascism? What does it mean to be a fascist? Fascism is a word that comes from Europe in the 20th century. And what is fascism? Fascism is colonialism come home. That's what fascism is, in brief. So my students in prison, they say, well, we're living under fascism. This is fascism, the way we live, and increasingly the way other people are living. So what is required of us, if I'm right, that we're in a constitutional fascist, we're living under a constitutional fascist government. And by that I mean a government that uses the law to undo the law. There are brown shirts, there are black shirts, there are paramilitary groups, some of them very active, mostly standing by and standing down, in Trump's words, because they don't have to be active. Because although I do believe that you're under surveillance, that right-wing citizen soldiers are filming you all the time, that fire bombings and assassinations are looming in the possible future. But I think mostly what they're doing is moving fast to take apart any kind of possible strengths of bourgeois democracy and creating a fascist authoritarian society. And it can seem like a big blur, all this stuff coming at us, but it all comes down to a few essential facts, like autocracy is one. So you wonder, well, why did they give a shit about, for example, the trains? I mean, Amtrak. Why did they attack Amtrak? Why did they attack the post office? Well, everything public is bad. Everything private is good. The lack of due process on these kind of constant and escalating attacks on people with green cards and so on, those are part of the autocratic, playbook. And you can read all about it in Project 2025, which I'm pretty sure most of you haven't read, but I did read because I didn't think it was going to be a blueprint for the second Trump administration. I thought it was an organizing document for the next 4 decades, which I still think it is, but they moved very quickly on all of that. So what is required, if I'm right, that we're living in a constitutional fascist, under a constitutional fascist government, what is required of us? Oh, and I said that most of the paramilitaries and so on are standing by and standing down, but not all of them. The Canary mission is actually very active, and it's not government, it's extra kind of judiciary, extra legal, but it is very active. Beitar is very active. So what is required of us, if I'm right, that it's a fascist, a fascist government. I think what's required of us is to build the broadest possible united front against both genocide in the Middle East, a pre-announced genocide that our government is supporting. I'm sure most of you were in the encampments in the spring. I was, and they were examples of, forms of democratic participation, organization, and activism. And they were crushed. So we're looking at the crushing of intellectual life, independent thinking, not just book banning, but the doing away with libraries and museums and any kind of historical memory. So I think we have to ask ourselves, where are we on the clock of the universe? What does it mean to be human in the 21st century today? What is required of us right now to resist the fascist onslaught? And those are the questions I think we should be concentrating on. Just one last thing. In the last several centuries that states have existed, only in the last 200 years has the state done anything to advance human freedom. And then only when there's enormous fire from below. And that is something that we should pay attention to. We don't have a model we can point to and say, this is how things work out. I would, in response to a couple of things said, I would say that we were absolutely right in 1968 to say that the empire is in decline. And the empire is still in decline. It has a lot longer life than we might have predicted when we were 20 years old. But there's no question that the empire is in crisis. And the overlapping crises that we're seeing have a lot to do with the empire in decline. But anyone who thought the empire in decline would be either neat or peaceful or fun was missing the whole point. The empire in decline is vicious and violent and racist and horrific. But I think we're still experiencing it. I think Obama was one potential answer by the ruling class. Trump is another answer. But that's the world we live in, and that's the world we have to analyze and make sense of. Thanks.
Now we ask the panelists to respond with each other. Alex?
Cool. Thanks. I thought what Bill said at the end there was very thought-provoking, and I think I agree on the sort of characterization of the present moment, and that we can see this as something which extends from the 60s onwards. But I think the answer about the solution being the broadest possible united front is a tempting one, but I think the maintenance of like an independent political perspective is really important within that, and at least in the UK context, we've had a lot of sort of sort of trying to sort of scare people with fascism into some kind of alliance with liberals and into sort of vague, broad organizations that don't have a defined agenda. So that's one thing.
We're not supposed to answer each other.
I'd like to ask for sort of just ask a question about. I think the sack of potatoes question is really, really interesting, and I can imagine the quotes that you would be sort of planning to draw on, and I think a lot of Marxists ignore the sort of subjective aspect and the ideas of collective work and collective experience and collective cultural experience that drew the proletariat together, and that also gave a lot of sort of discursive strength to Marx and Engels' argument for the proletariat's revolutionary class. But I do think potentially the party, in my opinion, a greater sort of political organization could be one way of cohering across these divisions. But I do agree that they're very real. That's it, I think.
Oh, I wanted to ask you a question, Bill, and then point something out to you. My first question is, what demonstration did you come from today, and who organized it? And can we donate to that group through Act Blue? And my second comment would be that the idea that the people who are surveilling us are particularly right-wing or Republican is misleading.
Absolutely, we surveil
Because,
ourselves.
well, maybe you can talk that way, but the surveillance state was built up through the Bush administration and then through the Obama administration. And I asked Bill Ivey, who was a friend of John Podesta, whose emails were leaked by WikiLeaks during the 2016 election, if he thought Barack Obama would do something to restore civil liberty and get rid of the Patriot Act, get rid of the surveillance state. And he said no, because that would be seen as too partisan. But the truth is that not only did Obama not get rid of the surveillance state, but he expanded it through the GEC.
Exactly.
And so what we have to do is avoid being drawn back into the Democratic Party and having our horizons lowered by this, duopoly, I guess is the way people talk about it. And your idea that we should be at a demonstration without questioning who's organizing it and what its politics actually are, I think is misguided and misleading and a form of miseducation. And I'll let you respond maybe if you want.
That's why I get called an activist, just mindlessly going along with, if I see a crowd, I just join. No, it's not. The thing, I want to say two quick things. One is that I don't know where you imply, and I'm not sure you're saying this, but there's nothing about my life that says that I'm asking anyone to join or even support the Democratic Party or give money to Act Blue. Nothing I've ever done would suggest that. I know I'm supposed to be a good friend of Barack Obama's, and as he said when he was asked about his relationship with me, he said, well, he was a guy around the neighborhood. And I got a lot of, and I got in a lot of trouble with my friends saying, were you really a friend of Obama's? And my response was always, well, I knew him well, but we never shared a milkshake with 2 straws. So I'm not close to the Democrat. I've never been, and I don't believe that that's the way to go. Okay. And when I said United Front, I agree very much with what Alex said, that you join a United Front holding on to your independent viewpoint and organization and so on. So, for example, if the people who don't want a united front against the pre-announced genocide in Gaza would drive me crazy. We can't be in a united front with the people who made that film and won that Oscar because somehow they don't have the purest line. I can be in a united front with them. We have to stop the genocide. We have to stop the American support of the genocide. It wouldn't be happening without our government. So, but do I lose hold of the fact that I actually think Palestine should be free? I never let go of that. That's my politics. But I can unite with people who want to end funding. All the people in JVP I can unite with around that one thing, never losing my own independent idea.
Yeah.
You could applaud.
Please clap.
So, I guess my 3 questions then. Now, in my mind, I kind of just imagine that you guys are like the 3 archetypical versions of the left. And maybe that's not true, but let's play along for a hot sec. I'd like to imagine that Doug is keeping alive the old left in some significant way with his prioritization of the working class and his challenge against both identity politics and also the Democratic Party's forms of censorship, which is actually something that I really appreciate and I love to see. So we've got, and people challenged me on that last night. They're like, well, Doug's not really old left. I'm like, well, come on, man, whatever. So Doug will be old left, and then Bill
the Communist Party. Okay,
Bill will be new left, and then I was calling Alex here left fusionist. Now, I don't know because I've only been able to read one thing that you wrote, but it does kind of just sound like you're trying to skirt out of the old left versus new left kind of conundrums and do something different, very mass. Of course, Bill sounds that way too now, so ideal types never really work out with real human beings, right? People probably have me pegged as some kind of a post-leftist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good word.
Don't identify that way. I would say I'm a political phenomenologist. So, my question for each of you then goes this way. That wasn't a joke. You don't even know what that means yet. Anyway, so for Doug, I want to ask you what you are doing. I understand you are doing stuff on the ground, organizing through, I think, the campaign for a socialist party with Chris. I'd like to hear more about that and what you're running into trying to organize within the PCFM, where people's primary identifications are in the niches. And then I always like to use this iconic meme. Maybe you've seen it. It's got the guy in the corner of the party holding the cup saying, "They don't know, ... There's all kinds of versions of that. But the basic idea is I'm saying that's us. That's each and every one of us is in the niches being like, they don't know. And we get our enjoyment from this, to sound like a Lacanian, even though I resent that when people say I am one. I'm not, okay? All right, and then for Alex, I'm curious, so after your time with Red Fight Back, what you have been doing since then. And then, and maybe you could say a couple words about Red Fight Back. And then for Bill, oh man, I want to know why kids? Why do you think kids are more of a revolutionary subject than parents? Parents care about the future more than kids. Kids are on their phones. I'm going to be the boomer here. Kids are on their phones. No, actually,
These guys were all on their phones.
So are my parents. But But I teach at the university right now, and I'm not so starry-eyed about it, right? And I don't see hope there. So I'll just leave it there.
Wow.
All right,
So you want to answer first?
We're going to start the Q&A in about 2 minutes, so
Okay.
respond.
Okay, I'm going to respond first. The Campaign for a Socialist Party is something that I am adjacent to at Sublation. We're aligned with it. The main thing that we're doing right now is I'm trying to launch a expansive realist writers workshop for free in Portland for anybody who wants to join. Some people who are affiliated or know you through Theory Underground are joining me in person, and we do it online as well. And the campaign itself is doing a lot of civil society organizing, just very traditional activist work. We're trying to get reports from the various people in the campaign published on the Substack, and that's how things are going. The primary thing that Sublation is doing right now is trying to head off or retreat back into the Democratic Party and push people to civil society organizing on some level in an experimental way. We don't know exactly what is needed. We're going to try to meet people's needs as we go along. So that's what Sublation is doing.
Alex, and then we'll go.
Alex.
Okay, as long as he gets to answer that one.
Yeah.
Oh, I shouldn't have said, please don't bring that up. But Red Fight Back was like a small kind of Maoist, third worldist, loosely sort of movement-orientated, community organizing type paranoid little group that I was part of for a few years. And that did lead me to, once I was able to sort of recover from it, did lead me to seeking out a more kind of open politics where you're able to converse about these things. And that's the history of that. So sort of farcical repetition of Bill's life in miniature, maybe. So I've moved to a more What am I?
Are you a part of a party or building a party right now?
I'm part of a small party that's sort of from the Trotskyist tradition originally, called RS21, split off from the SWP, but it's now like I would say a very sort of healthy, democratic, quite open, sort of multi-faction, multi-tendency group. And I'm sort of keeping my foot in that, and I think that is potentially the would also be my criticism of Platypus. You know, do you have a foot in these movements as well, to critique them. And that's what Prometheus is about, is, we're all involved in different organizations, but we all think that they should be unified into a mass party, and it's sort of figuring out how to make that argument to overcome the sectarianism of those groups.
Gotcha.
And creating a space for that.
Why?
Saying small communist party is just redundant. You can just say communist party, we get it, it's small. The thing you say about youth, I wasn't saying that youth is a class or that youth is a force of itself. I was more pointing to the fact that when people are in motion, I really like what you said, Doug, about an experimental approach to organizing wherever there are glimmers of movement against imperialism, against capitalism. We don't know where it's going to come from. If you think you know where the next jolt is going to come from, you're kidding yourself. The day before Rosa Parks sat in, the modern civil rights movement was impossible. And the day after, all the commentators said it was inevitable. I remember vividly when a group of the first generation, I was in the first generation of SDS, went to visit with Michael Harrington and Irving Howe and some of the old non-communist lefties. And at the meeting, Michael Harrington asked Al Haber, what does sitting in at lunch counters have to do with socialism? Duh. So they were contemptuous of the very thing that was going to explode in this country. Now you can say, but it didn't make a revolution. That's true. Neither did anything else. When I look to young people, I look to young people because young people are the ones who tend to be in motion around change. And that's true whether it's in the union movement or whether it's in the women's movement. And I really, I'd love to get into this question of whether feminism is reactionary, but I don't have time for that right this minute. But I'm also thinking of a wonderful conversation between Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, where Lenin says to her kind of sneeringly, what is all this talk about sex? What does sex have to do with socialism? And Luxemburg said, you wouldn't understand, you're old, which I think is really wonderful.
Alrighty, let's open the floor.
You'll never get to all of them, look.
Yeah.
We have time. We can do it all day.
Well, weren't we supposed to stop around? Oh, no, I guess.
Yeah, I think it goes for an hour, right?
Okay, good. Another till 2?
Yeah.
Oh, we could get some.
We get a good chunk. Forgot to.
So, Deb touched upon the feminism and anti-racism question, and I just want to give the rest of the panelists a chance to respond to that. He said the forms of feminism and anti-racism actually institutionalize these social problems that have ready-made solutions that don't really work, and I want you to respond to that.
Is that for you?
No, it's everyone else.
So we can go down the line.
Respond to me. I like this. David, you want to go first?
Was the question
What did
about
you think about what I said? That's the question.
About-
The
racism and
feminism and
sex-
anti-racism are ready-made solutions.
ready-made solutions, institutionalized,
Yeah,
made for democratic capture?
yeah, made for
Okay.
capture and being made permanent with
Yeah.
these kind of false solutions that then fail, and then they get
Yeah.
and the target shifts from
I don't- it's-
sex to race to back to sex.
Right. It seems like a wicked problem to me, and my heart goes out to, and I don't mean that like my heart literally goes out to everybody here, who no matter which wave of whichever movement you're a part of, but also the people who've been left behind by all those movements, the people who've been scapegoated by all those movements, the well-meaning people who are just trying to keep their head above water, who've had their heads smashed by people who consider themselves virtuous activists. I mean, really, there's good people on all sides. What can I say? I don't like it. I try to avoid people who primarily see things through the lenses of race or sex. I really do. I just avoid them. You see me as a white male, and you're a normie? Cool, I don't care. Or you're like someone in the know? Cool. But most of the time when someone calls me that, really they think that means I need to act a certain way and do a certain dance for them, and I'm not going to. So that's my issue with these kinds of movements. And the democratic version of it is horrific. And the leftist version of it is often like the democratic version. It's just more like mean or rude or something. Except for you all. I know you're all very good people here. So.
I mean,
all the men are clapping. That's great.
You don't know their gender.
You don't know their gender.
I don't want to get stuck in the binary for sure. So.
I don't feel as persecuted by these movements as maybe you do, but
I don't feel persecuted by any of it.
Okay.
I just know I can't take it back home to like people who didn't go to college, you know.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't. That doesn't resonate with me at all. Yeah, and I don't think it's just by virtue of the fact that you're organizing around race or sex and these questions, that somehow that's sort of ripe for co-optation. A lot of these things can be very oppositional to capitalism. I mean, socialism has also suffered co-optation. Communist parties have also suffered co-optation and sort of domestication into things which are acceptable. And abolition, I think, is something that it's very hard to imagine being acceptable. And I think that framework unleashes something which is impossible to put into whatever Democrat box you want.
So, first of all, read this book. When freedom is the question, abolition is the answer. He was just getting it. And whenever the question, but I want to take this thing on just as quickly as I can. People are fighting for their humanity, for democratic rights, for being recognized as fully human. And for the left, anyone on the left to disdain that or say, oh, it's so co-optable. Everything's co-optable. Everything is co-optable except, seizing state power, and that has its own, problems. But the idea that somehow feminism, because it can be co-opted by the Democratic Party, or let's just take DEI as a great example. When diversity, equity, inclusion came along and you saw the National Football League have a DEI officer, you knew it was phony as shit. And you knew it was being co-opted. And you knew that it had nothing to do with fighting white supremacy. It was what it was, a co-optable, kind of a way to make it co-optable. Then that becomes an arena of struggle. That becomes a place where we fight against white supremacy and say, no, DEI is some liberal sop. It's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something much deeper. And now, when the fascists take power and they obliterate certain words, Gulf of Mexico, you can't say it, women, oppression, you can't say those words, then I think we have to push back, not to demand that the DEI come back to the University of Michigan, but rather that fighting white supremacy is actually an important part of building a kind of revolutionary consciousness and a revolutionary culture. So we should be doing that. When I think of these issues, for example, and let's take the environmental movement, or let's take queer liberation. Are those things co-optable? Yes, in many ways, and we see them as contested spaces. But because they're contested spaces is no reason for us to leave the field and say, oh, that's a democratic issue, saving the environment. Fuck that. Marx actually wrote about that shit, and it matters. It matters, it matters imminently. And the fact that people are mobilized around that now is not a bad thing. That's a good thing. We should enter into that united front, represent a revolutionary solution to the environmental crisis that's upon us, and organize around that. This raises the question, you both raised the question for me, about privilege. And the problem with privilege is that it too gets psychologized and co-opted. So we talk about privilege as if it's a matter of guilt or shame. Privilege is actually a narcotic that's given to lots and lots of people, including the aristocracy of labor, to buy them off from being in solidarity. So we should be talking about solidarity, not service, comradeship, not allyship. And we should join in by rejecting the toxic drug of privilege and saying, no, I won't be silenced because you've given me a little bit of extra something. And we all are subject to it, every one of us. Male privilege, gender privilege, white privilege, class privilege, American privilege. We all have it. And again, the way to attack it isn't some psychological cleansing. It's to recognize that you're being duped, and you're losing your real comrades, and move against that.
Can I respond to? Okay,
Please.
I just would say that my claim was not that these things have been co-opted. Okay, my claim is that from the start, the framework, the ideology of these movements is co-opted. On the way here, I'm from Portland, so in the Portland airport, my son Noah pointed out to me that Kindy's book Anti-Racist Baby was available, and I have not found a more racist book than that one in my life. I thought we should publish a book called Racist Baby, but we wouldn't have to change the interior, at all. There's a way in which the racial categories, sexual categories are reified. They're reified in order to keep people in these categories in a coalition within the Democratic Party. And I'm just, in order to really debate this, I wish Adolph Reed was here to address
I
it.
wish you were too.
Okay, go ahead.
The problem is with a word like racism or sexism, the problem is it means two distinct things in the American vocabulary. It means bigoted, backward, stupid idiocy. So we all can say, well, I'm not racist because I'm not bigoted, backward, and stupid. Or it can mean living in a society in which privilege and oppression is structured around color, historically and to this day. The afterlife of slavery is with us. So just as in the days of slavery, the question wasn't, do you own slaves? It's, are you benefiting from the system that's creating the wealth in this country? And the answer is, for white people, yes, you are, whether you're in New York or Rhode Island or Minnesota. So the question is, what are you doing to destroy slavery? Not, are you a good person? Who gives a fuck?
All right.
Good, next question. In the back. Annie.
He's
Okay,
a
I
plant.
wanted to
He's a
respond
plant in here.
They're all
to the question of the panel.
Yeah, they're all plants.
Okay. Why does society have politics? I wanted to frame it in a different way that I think came up, maybe about what did you see as the relationship of society to the state? Meaning, I think Alex and Bill, Bill, at one time you sort of mentioned the last few centuries the state has been, that the state has been emancipatory for the first time for, I'm guessing, the mass of people.
No.
You didn't say this, I hallucinated.
No, I didn't say it. I said in the 5,000-year history of states, only in the last 2 centuries has any state made any gesture
Okay, that's what I was saying.
toward increasing freedom, and only with fire from below.
Okay. I stick by exactly what I said there. So,
I disagree.
and Alex, you brought up also the social republic. So this idea of actually achieving a true democracy. Now I think Dave and Doug, you kind of emphasize more the state as potentially erupting on the freedoms of society. So Dave, you mentioned the Wilsonian education as undermining our ability to experience education to such a degree that we're behind enemy lines. And then also, Doug, I listened to several times and what you think about this. And even then, at the end, you mentioned that people are fighting for their democratic rights because they're fighting for their humanity. Bill, you said that. So I kind of want to get, what do you guys see as the relationship of the state to society? Because I think it's related to this kind of argument that's happening about political independence or joining in, or what does it mean, maybe the skepticism of the movements there, this kind of question. And I'm sorry about the feedback.
Who wants to start off? The relationship, state, and society?
Come on, Doug.
Okay. Well, I did try to explain how I thought politics and the state emerged from society and due to the way in which the freedom of labor entered into contradiction with itself. So I think what we're facing, and it's a very large task, is to organize society independently of the current politics of the state, independently of the ideologies of those political players, and for itself. So society as the realm of free workers is what needs to be organized. But it's going to be very difficult to, remain clear or get clear of state intervention in our politics, because so many quasi-governmental, quasi-state players are organizing left politics for us all the time. How many FBI agents were part of Weather Underground? I mean, okay, yeah. But during the church committee, it did come forward that a lot of the New Left and the most
That's just nonsense.
no, but not your organization, but
Citing FBI documents?
no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that I asked a question. It was a question. I'm saying that there were a lot of New Left organizations that had been infiltrated by COINTELPRO.
Of course.
Right, and that we're always facing that risk. And at this
they're
point,
here, by the way.
and at
They're
this
here.
point, we can't really we often don't distinguish well now between when we are COINTELPRO and when we're not, because we accept so much of the NGO world. We accept the way our politics are infiltrated by the state. We even aim to be part of those co-opting organizations often enough. So,
When you say we, who do you mean?
I mean the left. I mean
Well,
your left. I mean, someone said I was an old left. You said I was an old left. I'm not. I'm just part of the new, like the remnants of this guy's left, trying to figure it out.
Have a left.
Okay, and so that's what I would say. All right, I've had enough of that. I
Thank you.
guess.
Yeah, I'll make it short if I can. But basically, state, church, and capital are three traditional, modes, forces, institutions of power. I don't understand how they work. I'm trying to for the last 10 years. And what I want to focus in on is how the school has functioned to take up various aspects of all three, where it functions to reproduce the relations of production and to discipline us to fit into the meritocracy, to see us as deserving our poverty or to see us as deserving a six-figure salary, right? And so the quote I wanted to read, because it is worth reading, from Woodrow Wilson in 1909. This is a reaction to 1905, but also the American Black and White Farmers Alliance from the previous century. He says, this is his vision for progressive education, as he understood it. We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privileges of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. Which goes right along with the occasional letter number 1 by the Rockefeller Institute, which, the Rockefellers and Carnegies, the richest people in the world at the time, much richer and more powerful than Musk today, right? Because there were fewer billionaires in the field. They said, in our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions of intellectual and moral education fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple. We will organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. It's a site of class struggle. We typically focus on prisons, but when you're sent down to detention, the warning is prison's next, kid, right? And when you're made an example of in front of your peers, when you're ranked and ritually hazed in front of your peers, it shapes your entire life and how you live. And so, yeah, I kind of just wanted to focus in on that, so thank you.
Do you want to talk about the state and society?
Sure. Yeah. Well, just on the spies thing, Bolsheviks had a Tsarist spy as one of their representatives in the Duma, and that's one solution. You can give them a really difficult job to do, and But on the other hand, you have COINTELPRO, we have spy cops in the UK, and the sort of damage done to people, in that case women, who were sort of tricked into relationships with undercover police and had children with them and built a life with them. The damage is tremendous, but and also the sort of psychological impact on our movements, and the challenge is to kind of not allow that to then feed into some kind of self-censorship or self-restriction, and to still be determined to operate openly, and to share what you're doing and the thinking behind what you're doing with the wider movement. I think that's an important thing. In general, on the state, a lot of our movements have tried to sort of dodge the question of the state, and with Corbynism, that was particularly a problem we had. You know, one of the manifesto promises was 10,000 more police on the street, and that's why the social republic has been quite an animating idea for us at Prometheus and in other circles, because it gives some sort of suggestions, some sort of ideas from history that you can draw from and adapt to your own setting, for how you might overcome particularly the repressive arm of the state, and it resonates with like the critique of like, abolitionism as well. Yeah.
No question. We don't all have the answer.
Hi. I'll just put this in a really direct way. A little bit too. Is that good? Okay. I'll just put this in a really direct way. Should we be terrorists? I don't mean that in a funny way. So obviously the turn towards the party, and like, you know, as part of your generation, Bill, like the reflection on like organizing for revolution or like a party for socialism, like that question kind of arises and turns to like clandestine action, you know, towards the late 60s and there's like a logic to that. And I just think about in terms of like going to where the kids are now. I can say, you know, I'm 23, so I'm freshly out of college, but I do interact with them just through Platypus. Kids are like deeply nihilistic, and the experience of the encampments has been, if anything, like deeply depoliticizing, and like despairing, and like the only political alternative or the only possibility for political action seems to be terrorism. Luigi Mangione, Tesla, firebombing, whatever. How does this relate to, like, if we're undergoing the same crisis that seems to have been going on since the 60s, the long decline in the US, whatever, this social crisis, where does this turn to terrorism come from? And why was it wrong in the first place?
Do you guys want to answer that?
Who wants to start?
Yeah, shall we?
Okay.
The little piece that I was writing this morning, but I couldn't finish it. It's called The Lone Flagman, and I'm thinking about the lone gunman phenomenon and the desperation people feel today. And I'm thinking about these people that I've seen all for the last month and a half on tour. We've been on a tour across the United States, and I keep seeing lone people with flags. Usually 2 flags. It used to be like the guys who with the gun rack on their truck and they got the 2 flags, but now it's like the person who looks like they're chronically online and they finally came out and they've got a couple flags over their shoulders. It's often a Palestine flag and a rainbow flag. In the case of the gal who walked up to us last week when we were reading about the Weathermen, she had some Italian Catholic flag. I don't know, but she also had a Palestine flag. I'm thinking about lone action as opposed to organized, concerted political efforts, whether those be terroristic or not. And I just feel like people are really desperate. And when we glorify the group action, people get it in their heads as individuals they should go off and try these things. And I just kind of wanted to say, it's hypostitional. It's a term we use, which is like the opposite of hyperstition. For those of you who know about the neo-reactionary movement, hyperstition is like a way of building up hype around a myth or a narrative or a fiction that somehow changes reality as people start to think different because you're putting the idea out, right? And so a lot of sloganeering is hype, or is trying to be hyperstitional, but we've come up with this term hypostitional, which is, it's the opposite. By trying to do that, but having sort of, I guess, the inability to sort of read the room of the post-class fracturedness, you actually end up doing the opposite of what you're trying to do. And I think when you go out there and it's, instead of a show of force, it's a show of weakness, I think it has an opposite effect. And so, Luigi Mangione or Aaron Bushnell, the self-immolation man, I think we feel it, we all feel it, but also don't see a future in it. And so I don't endorse terrorism. I have to say that because when you ask the question of should we do terrorism, I started nodding profusely. I didn't mean yes, I meant like, good question. I don't endorse terrorism, no. Not for you either, Bill.
Yeah, I agree. I don't endorse terrorism either. I think that, and I don't think we were terrorists. I think that we were called terrorists, and a lot of people are called terrorists, but we were very much part of a large anti-war movement, and we had been, the country had turned against the war. In 1965, about 70% of Americans supported the war in Vietnam. The terrorism was all coming from the United States government. The United States government was killing 6,000 people a week, and it was a terrorist assault. It was a genocidal assault on Vietnam. In 3 years of organizing and activism, we had moved the country, not we personally, but the Black Freedom Movement, GIs Coming Home, the anti-war folks who were organizing. We had moved the country from being 70% in favor of the war to about 45% in favor of the war. And in the world, it was 90% against the war. So it was a huge, huge victory by that point. But the war dragged on for another 7 years. And every week that the war went on, 6,000 people were murdered in terrorist assaults by our government. So what we did was to object. Now, one of the things the Vietnamese taught me and taught us is that a revolution takes place on many, many fronts. There is a military front to it. There's a moral front. There's a political front. There's a social, psychological, cultural front. And the Vietnamese could never have won if they had fought on the military only. They were not terrorists, but they were not fighting a military war. They were fighting a political, moral, ethical, cultural war as well. So I think it's very important to say, no, terrorism doesn't work. I had a really odd thing happen to me when I was on book tour in the fall. I was speaking in Troy, New York with Barbara Smith the day after Mangione killed that guy. And after everybody else had lined up and I'd signed books, these three anarchists came up to me and said, whispering, what do you think? And I said, I think I got my grown-up pants on, and I said, I think it's really a mistake, and it will not lead to anything. And 5 days later, I wish I'd had their email so I could write them and apologize. But who knew that it would unleash that? But it did, and I'm not endorsing that kind of thing at all. But I do think that the only thing that really changes society, that really changes the direction of things, is mobilization of masses of people, and that's something we can talk about at length. Terrorism has a very stable definition. It's violence against ordinary folks in order to create your political, in order to push your political position. That's what the right wing is doing right now. And I've said I'm worried about not only the paramilitaries that are standing down and standing by, I'm worried about where the Reichstag event is going to come from. What assassination is going to lead to more doing away with more, due process and so on. So I'm worried about things like the paramilitaries firebombing bookstores, firebombing meetings like this. So I worry about that kind of terrorism. But one last thing is that I think the left around the anti-war movement, for example, I disagree with your analysis of the encampments, but I think that to the extent that people say, let's all get on Signal. I mean, Signal's gotten a big reputation in the last couple of weeks, but said, I don't want to be on Signal. And I don't think the response to the university crushing the encampment here on this campus was to all get on Signal and debrief it. If it's our spycraft against theirs or our military against theirs, they will win every time. You don't need Signal. What you need is a mass meeting after the encampment is crushed, because that's where our strength is.
Good point.
Can I say one thing in
Say
full?
one thing and then
Okay.
go to the question.
I would just say, rather than thinking about it as terrorism, you might think about it as a propaganda of the deed, which also should be avoided. It doesn't work. It's a bad strategy. And I would say the other thing to recognize is that the idea that there are lone gunmen, you might want to question that as well. There was just a hearing on the JFK assassination. True. Lee Harvey Oswald was under surveillance by the CIA, folks, and there was more than one shooter. So here.
This is a question, Bill. When you're in the weather on the ground, do you think you're trying to change the state or society? Like the ends of it, was it the state? Or,
That's a good question.
I mean, I think our view was that we were trying to build kind of a military wing of the left movement in order to do two things. One was to take the war to the war makers, to make it painful for them. And two was to create the condition to survive what we thought was an impending American fascism. So we were definitely aimed at the state, but we didn't think that we were going to take state power. We thought there had to be many more masses of people. And we saw a lot of indications, not only among, in various struggles, including in the labor movement. And we thought that there had to be a party, and we wanted to be a part of that. We weren't building it, but we wanted to be a part of it. And we were aimed at the state.
Anybody else want to?
I have to say something. So I try to be like a realist about things, right? But also I try to keep a radical imagination, right? I think we have to work within the parameters.
Oh, that's right.
Within the parameters of sort of what's almost immutable given the circumstances. And so that instead of being a capitalist realist, I try to be a realist about capital. And I have to say the same thing about the state, which just means like it's sort of this immutable fact. You know, there might be something we can do about it eventually, but working within the parameters of a state that is by its very nature repressive, a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. I just have to say, terrorism is usually defined as also acts against that legitimate monopoly of force. And so when a person speaks in the name of the oppressed, makes themselves a representative of people who aren't actually there, and then does some act in their name, and it's not necessarily legitimate. It might become retroactively legitimated if it were to, for instance, do something more than spawn some viral memes, which is what Mangione did. What does it actually mean to get people out in the streets and not burn them out and make them all give up on ever doing that again, right? Just getting them out in the streets is not, or getting them to meme it, isn't necessarily going to turn into anything sustainable or long-term. And sort of the thing about the state is that it has proven sustainable and long-term. So I'm not saying that I'm a reformist. I'm not saying I'm a revolutionist. I'm very, very skeptical of the definition of terrorism that forgets about, it's an act against the state too, right? Usually in the name of some group. And I'm not saying that group is necessarily represented either. I'm skeptical of that. So.
You know, I agree with you about you know,
sorry, what?
People. I agree with you that people going into the streets endlessly is exhausting and burning out. I think people sitting in an auditorium talking about Kautsky and Lenin is also burning people out.
Yeah. Can I say one thing about this? I do think that the goal has to be organizing the working class to take charge of, smash, and transform the state. That would be the period called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and I'm for it. I just wanted to put that out there, and I don't think we shouldn't be afraid of the enormity of that task. We should see it as a challenge in terms of organizing and connecting to working people.
And what working class? Which working class?
Which proletariat?
The international
There you go.
working class.
I wanted you to say it.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a plant.
Potatoes. Yeah.
They're all plants.
I know.
I want to try keeping the focus on what seems to be an organically evolving thread, and it is about developing pessimism, especially among people who are my contemporaries politically, and how that can manifest as a depoliticization, pessimism lashing out. And I think back to the New Left, for example, and how in the wake of 1968, where Students for a Democratic Society saw the political ascendance of the Nixon administration, and not long after it seems to disintegrate and follow a similar course. And what I wonder is, Nixon and the Johnson administration before that, and Reagan afterwards, and FDR beforehand, are all called fascist. And the point might be that I'm wondering about is this a politically useful category, insofar as maybe it's descriptively correct that we can analogize it to something like Hitler's Germany, and yet at the same time it seems as though in many contexts it actually demobilizes. Or when we read backwards historically, it seems as though what follows despite that recognition or that identification is that it seems not to amount to the political aspirations articulated in conjunction with it.
You want to respond to that? That seems like more of a comment than a question.
It's a good comment.
Yeah, what's the meaning of talking about fascism in politics?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that goes to Bill, I think.
Well, no, I'm sure
He used the word. I didn't use the word.
Okay. Well, look, I agree with the sentiment of your question, and like that's why I read it as a comment, because I was like, yeah, you're right. I do look. The problem with fascism as a descriptor for our society is that it has been accurately applied to so many administrations, or totalitarian anyhow, or the idea of the corporate world and the state intertwining. Like that's just a fact about our society and has been since I was born, probably. So is this a fascist society? In some ways, yes. Is it more fascist now than it was last year? I don't think so. So the reason why it's a bad idea to focus on fascism is because when we do that, we tend to go along with a certain characterization of one party, the Republicans usually, as opposed to the other party, and it's a way to remain within that dynamic of capitalist politics. So I would say, when is Trump being fascist? How is Trump being fascist? When was Biden fascist? How was he fascist? Biden was fascist when he set up instruments of censorship for the mass of society and including legacy media. Trump is being fascist when he denies people due process rights when they're deported. Biden was being fascist and really frightening when he gave Ukraine long-range missiles to attack Russia despite knowing that it was a red line and could lead to nuclear Armageddon, which, by the way, according to the New York Times, that the Biden administration itself knew that there was a 50% chance of a nuclear exchange occurring during the last 3 years. Is it fascist? Yes. Is this an unacceptable society, or is the society through the state and the domination of society by the state unacceptable? Does it need to be combated because it's imposed upon or limiting our freedom? Absolutely. Is it different now than it was last year? No.
Alex, given the United Front and Social Republic, do you want to say something?
About the
question, fascism?
Well, I think that that is a useful way for thinking about it, and we can think about that as well with Starmer. One of the particularly fascist things he is doing is attempting to force people back into work, responding to the disabling of people and the rendering ill of people through work and through COVID, and by attempting to sort of cut the minimum support to people in the full knowledge that some people are going to die. And then that's something that they're sort of openly doing in order that it might force the sort of very small number of people that can be forced back into work. And I think there may be some utility to using the term fascism in that way. Ultimately, it's just a word. I don't think it has that much power. Yeah.
Phil, do you want to get this before? I'll
just a
go
quick word.
I do have something.
I mean, I think that what Doug said is helpful about the ways in which this administration or that administration is fascist and the ways in which they're not. I think that's helpful. But the way you asked the question or made the comment, since we had the fascist government with Biden and with Bush and with Obama, and then there is no difference, is what you seem to say.
Can I maybe just clarify?
Yeah.
Maybe there is a difference. I guess what I'm wondering is when we seem to raise fascism in all these contexts, what is politically useful about it then? Because it seems to be broad and flexible.
Yeah.
I take your point, but I think that it's important to note that the left generally, and I think it's hard to speak about the left generally because we're a scattered, kind of grouping of organizations and non-entities. But the left in general has had a very naive approach to elections as long as I've been alive. That is, we don't have a strategy for moving forward, for building power, for building movements. And it has an electoral piece of it, but it's not about the elections. And I felt it very acutely in the last go-around, because to pretend that there's no difference, even between Clinton and between Hillary Clinton and Trump, is very convenient for you. But what happened to Roe versus Wade? That had real implications for real people that you care about. So the idea that somehow there is no difference and I wouldn't be dirtied by getting involved in voting, that's a very different question. And I think we have been enormously naive.
Okay, so fascism. I've been accused of this. Hands up if you've been accused of it.
Being a fascist.
I'm not
being
gonna,
a fascist. Yeah, hands up if you've been accused of it. All right.
Bill.
Only a third of you? Come on, you're not brave.
Never.
You're not saying things in public. If you say things in public, it's guaranteed to happen. I mean, everything's fascism now. But I like what you're all saying. Now, listen. When I read Mussolini on what is fascism, I like to get to the primary sources, right? And I think Hitler took a lot of inspiration from Mussolini. And in that piece, he basically is saying, you bundle up all the things that work. Right? And so for him, what does that mean? It's going to be a little different than what it means for Hitler. Everybody who bundles together all the things that are supposedly tried and true, all the things that work, could be called a fascist if we just go with that kind of a definition. It's myth-making about, we retroactively build this story that quilts us all together, the things that work. Maybe that's Catholicism, maybe that's anti-Semitism, maybe that's socialism, or at least socialist rhetoric for workers, And so there's all these things that are resonating that seem to be working. You bundle them, you bundle them, you bundle them. But what's the opposite of that? It's intersectionality. So fascism, we could call it winner fascism. And then you take underdog fascism or loser fascism, is to say you take all the things that have lost through history and you bundle them into a bundle of sticks and you say, this'll work. And I'm just like, well, I don't like either one because they both require a bunch of scapegoats. And they just necessarily do the shock troops for the PCFM production thing that I was talking about. And so if I go with that bundling approach, then that's what I come to. So.
Aaron?
I'm a student at Columbia University, and so for the last several weeks, former students and students at the university who were involved in the Palestinian encampment and related things have been expelled from the university or suspended, and then very famously, Mahmoud Khalil is being deported and held in a prison in Louisiana. And I was at Columbia last spring. I attended talks that were given at the encampment on the lawn. So I've been observing this for quite some time, and the students, especially in the student union and other organizations, think there needs to be kind of a popular front on campus to get the administration of Columbia to denounce Donald Trump. So they think of it as kind of like a popular front resistance movement, and they're disappointed that the professors that they thought were like real Democrats basically are not defending them against the state. And so I wanted to ask about, because I talked to my classmates about this. They think I'm a Marxist. They want to ask me questions, right? And it seems to me just a kind of unavoidable fact that all of these experiences on our campus for the last year are not leading my classmates to become socialists, and it's not leading my classmates to become revolutionaries, and it's not leading my classmates to become utopians. I went to a meeting of the SJP on my campus, and there everyone was told that one has to defend the ancient blood rights that Palestinians have to the land, and that's why Israel is wrong, is because the people of Israel are Jewish and they're from another place and they don't belong there. To me, that doesn't sound like socialism, and that doesn't sound like a utopia. So I want to ask, what's the point of political action? Why do we do political action? And where does utopia come from, right? That's the idea of politics. You want to have politics, you want to change the world, you think it needs to be a better place, you care about freedom and all of these sorts of things. What actually produces utopia? What is it, right? Why does utopia exist, and what would it mean to have a politics that's in some way utopian or emancipatory or deals with freedom? Just wanted to pose that question.
Who's got the mic?
Go down the line. Who wants to go first?
You want to go first?
First of all, you're saying this action doesn't lead to revolutionary consciousness or socialist consciousness. Okay, I buy that. I think we can't sit here at the University of Chicago in this auditorium and figure out what should be going on at Columbia. You didn't offer a solution to that problem, so I don't know what you think ought to happen. But I'd have to be part of that group to be able to figure it out. I think Columbia, obviously they brought shame upon themselves, the administration, and obviously I think you're way beyond getting a group together that's going to make the administration do anything. I mean, no matter what they do, they're slipping into the sewer again and again. But the question of utopia is a different question. We had dinner with Eduardo Galeano some years ago, 30 years ago, and Eduardo Galeano is the Uruguayan revolutionary who wrote Open Veins in Latin America, and we had this great conversation. We both agreed that we've been called not only fascists, but idealists and romantics and utopians. And Galeano told a great story, which he subsequently wrote about. And the story was that somebody said to him, "What good is utopia?" And and Galeano's response was, "Well, you have a point there. I take 2 steps towards utopia, and utopia takes 2 steps away. I walk 10 steps towards utopia. Utopia walks 10 steps away. So what good is utopia?" And his response was, "It's good for walking." And I think there's something important in that. You raised Beckett in the beginning, and one of my favorite little series from Beckett, didn't you raise Beckett?
I did.
Yeah.
I raised Beckett.
Yeah. So, this idea, and you also talked about organizing in an experimental fashion, and I think that's hugely important. So I'm a big believer in try, fail, try again, fail better. And if you are in the business of being a revolutionary, you're going to fail a lot. And you might as well try to fail better and try to learn from it. And so I think that the importance of having a utopian vision is that that's very much what Project 2025 is. It's a utopian vision. It's a North Star. It's where they're going. And that's why it's worth reading, because all what seems like random shit actually is summed up there in a very clear way. They're aimed at a certain kind of society, and they've got a North Star. I think the left needs that kind of thinking. We need to have a sense of where it is we want to go, what we're positing as a positive view of human beings. So I think, again, just two other quick points. If we were meeting here in 1855, just us 100 people or whatever we are, we might have been much smaller. And we're all abolitionists, and we're all going to end slavery. That's a utopian vision. It's not only a minority position, it's a position that puts us against the Constitution, against the founders, against the law, against the Bible, against the preacher, against our parents and neighbors. But fuck it, we're all abolitionists now, and we are going to fight for it, and it's 1855. Who could believe that in 10 years it would actually come to be? And then, of course, it's co-opted and reversed, and the counter-revolution takes over, of course. But that's a utopian vision, the utopian vision of a life without slavery. And my friend Stanley Howard and Ronaldo, two of my students, Stanley Howard and Ronaldo Hudson, both were on death row in Illinois when they were in their early 20s. And they decided that they weren't going to die in an Illinois prison. They were going to fight for the abolition of the death penalty. They created a movement. I mean, the longer story of it I can't tell, but they created something called the Death Row 10 that led to the mothers of the Death Row 10, that led to lawyers and journalists, and really a mass movement starting at Northwestern University that demanded an end to the death penalty. And 20 years ago last year, it was done. A right-wing, corrupt Republican government ended the death penalty in Illinois. That was a utopian vision, and one that was worth fighting for.
Okay, I want to answer your question about how the encampments might have led to people having a utopian vision and maybe even moving towards socialism, and by offering a utopian vision. And my utopian vision is this. Last year, when the heads of these Ivy League, the presidents of these Ivy League universities were put in front of Congress, wow. And they were cross-examined about their commitment to free speech and their and the way they enforce the rules. If there had been, about student conduct, they didn't enforce the rules of student conduct properly. If there had been an inkling on the left that the way in which these students were going to be attacked was through Title VI.
Yes.
And if there had been a way to organize against that, basically, it might have been like a Red-Brown Alliance or something, because it would have been saying, listen, we have to organize for free speech on campus. We have to do something about the way Title VI is used to suppress speech, not just left-wing speech, not just pro-Palestinian speech, but, all these right-wingers have been complaining about it for a while, and they're right. And if there had been a way to organize to change that, or to roll back that law that it was suppressing academic speech, and especially the students, there might have been a way in which divisions between people were overcome, and they could have seen a victory that would have protected them from the cops later on. Because that is the way in which, one way that Trump is going after the pro-Palestinian movement is by opportunistically taking advantage of that civil rights legislation. And, but the problem was there was no way to criticize Title VI from within the left, because that would have been to accept a right-wing critique of it from the past, and also just to smear the reputation of the great victories of the civil rights movement. So So yeah, but my utopian vision is that we could get beyond dogmatic thinking and actually take up practical political tasks when they arise. All right.
Cool. Yeah, I think we have many of the same problems in social movement organizing and sometimes as with the encampment and student organizing. And I think the assumption that sort of if socialists are going from whatever like little group they're in and going into these movements and making the case for why it's all capitalism's fault and so on, that's going to lead people to join their movements, and it doesn't really happen, and we're left kind of scratching our heads. And I think because of the history that we've had of the 20th century, we need much more utopia, and we need to sort of create a new utopian vision of socialism that can convince people. And at the moment, we're still lacking that. And I think that's the step that takes people from sort of opposing the manifestations of capitalism and how it affects them around a particular issue or campaign, and then sort of committing themselves to socialism, which is a massive step to take.
I think there was a period of time when I was sort of like one of the dumb kinds of Marxists. There's lots of smart Marxists, but there's a kind of dumb Marxist that's just like, oh, we can't be cooking up in the cook shops, those utopias, blah, blah, blah. And I would kind of say those sort of things, right? There's no point thinking about such things. And I mean, I'm still kind of dumb this way, but I actually, my issue is with the long-termness of it, right? There's a sort of action, maybe it's sort of anarchist, activist, folk, political, localist, sort of Occupy style. It's immediacy. It's now this, now this. It's those who are present speaking in the name of everyone else who has to work. And it's all like right now, right now, right now. Versus this other approach that wants genuine, large-scale, structural change. And I'm much more favorable towards the latter, obviously. But there's a middle option. It's like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. The utopias I have in mind prefigure or work towards a society in which people have time energy, which, as I define it in my master's thesis and books and whatnot, is large energy-infused, repeatable blocks of time reliably available in a society. Okay. Obviously not something that's going to be possible when most people are reduced to the commodity labor power by a regime of schools and prisons that turns us into that, right? What's the middle option? It's T3 institutions, as Benjamin Studebaker puts it, which is to say, institutions that foster the conditions for people to be able to have the time energy to discover their talents and then cultivate them under tutelage. Time energy, talent, tutelage. You need institutions for that. You can't do it alone. If you have free time but you don't have the institutions with the mentorship, with the intergenerational belonging, with the others, it's not going to work. And so T3 institutions and time energy, that's what I'm all about. And I think that there are concrete things that we can do in the near future to develop them. And that's what I want to focus on.
One last word. One last word. I think there's a great utopian novel out called Everything for Everyone. And you can find it easily. It's become a big seller. But the trope is it's an oral history taken 30 years from now about the revolution that took place in 2040 or something like that. But the thing that's important about it is utopia is not heaven. Utopia is human. That means we're all fucked up, and we will stay being fucked up without exploitation, without the most cruel things. But the idea that somehow we'll get to utopia where we're not fucked up, that's not happening.
All right, let's take
Benjamin.
Let's take one last question and wrap this into our closing remarks. Salim?
It's a rather short question, but maybe it's good for wrapping up. Also, back to the topic, and also maybe building upon what you said, Bill. Will there always be politics? I mean, you were referring to this book, which is taking place in the future after the revolution. Will there always be politics? If yes, why? And if no, why not?
Just for me, yeah. I don't think there will always be politics. I think that there will always be conflicts between people and forms of organizing society. But I think the idea of socialism is to get to a point where, because we are self-responsible and have some self-understanding, our self-organization will lose its political character. And it will be a matter of working together creatively to be as productive and actualized as we can. I mean, the vision of a Marxist is that, you know, in the future, your average human will be smarter than Einstein, more creative than Mozart, a better lover than Madonna.
Holy shit.
So, I mean, I think that's what we should look forward to in trying to actualize. And, you know, but we don't have to knock ourselves out trying to do that last one right this second, especially not at 54. Anyway, yeah, that's my answer to that. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, I think there will always be politics because there will always be people, and people are going to always be contesting things. My goal is to do away with. My goal is freedom and socialism. And socialism, freedom without socialism, as we all know, is extraction, exploitation, and predation. But socialism without freedom is cruelty and slavery and oppression. So I want to struggle towards freedom and socialism, but I don't imagine us getting to utopia. I imagine us always struggling toward it, and we can put in all kinds of structural and consciousness that will make that more possible. But I don't think we'll be without politics.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think there'll always be people sort of contesting things, and there'll always be different claims. But I do hope there will be there'll not be domination, but I think there will have to be politics to contest domination as it emerges, which it just will.
Right.
I hope so. I hope that there will be no more politics. But if politics is also just dealing with intractable disagreements between people, right? Because people are in different bodies and have different perspectives, as Benjamin puts it.
Right.
I like that way of thinking about it. It sounds kind of like the way that Bill's thinking about it. As long as there are people and they have disagreements, then there will be politics. Okay. But if we're talking about politics like voting and protesting, like if we're thinking about the American simulacrum that we call politics, like, I mean, my God, I think we can all agree that we hope and think that doesn't have to go on. That we could put an end to that, whatever that is, right? So, yeah,
Exactly.
let's end that.
Right on.